150 years of key tempering stage, 200 years of foundation establishment, 500 years of golden elixir, 1,000 years of spirit nucleation stage, and then gifting. Nevertheless, it was worth it to make a breakthrough on the day of the upper limit. Zhu Fan, a modern man whose soul has been transmigrated into a dying beggar, is now an outer disciple of the Celestial Throne sect, striving to become a wielding life sage. He has become hostage to the system that gave him all the qualities to be on top of the world, but instead the guy has to languish his existence in the shadows. Perhaps all of this is done so that a home cultivator can appear in this world for the first time. However, Zhu Fan knew that there was an unusual world outside that he would love to see. Still, it was dangerous because in 6 years, the guy had reached the 4th step. This was the pace of the most mediocre disciple. Nevertheless, he believed that after countless years, he would surely reach the peak. After all, the most important thing in this business is stability, and the one who survives wins. He touched the wall with his hand. At the same moment, the barrier in front of his face slid open. The boy entered a short, dark hallway. In the room on the other side, there was a huge model of the city. Zhu Fan was confident that he would soon be able to return home again, and if it succeeded, it wouldn't matter how long the wait lasted. He walked closer and put the makeshift car on the road. Looking at the tall models of skyscrapers, the guy sighed heavily and thought that so far there was no use of these dreams. Still, he was calm because he had an older brother who could take care of his parents. So now he had to take care of himself. The protagonist stepped into the courtyard of his house. His humble plot was located in the Feiyu world within the Heavenly Throne sect. Stepping outside the fence, Zhu Fan shuffled his foot, dispersing the air currents. Then he took a big leap. This time it was time for him to sign up for some classes. The disciple learned a little bit of everything to stretch his progress. All this was done so as not to accidentally make a premature breakthrough. Flying over the dense forest, the boy suddenly heard someone calling his name. It was Wang Yulong. Being at the 4th stage of key tempering, he had slain a rank 6 beast with a punch, making him immediately considered talented. Zhu Fan stopped and landed. Wang Yulong ran up to the guy and asked when he would teach him the mid-level body relief technique. The disciple claimed that if one developed this ability to the highest level, one would be able to fly even faster than with the Skyrider technique. But the protagonist told his interlocutor that if he wanted to move faster, he should train less on attacking techniques, and then he would have time to develop body relief. Wang Yulong disagreed, saying that in that case, he would be left defenseless if he met a wild beast in the forest. However, Zhu Fan replied that in such a case, one could simply not go into the forest to avoid facing dangers. Wang Yulong continued to not understand why such a talented disciple would always favor the path of cowardice. 3 months ago, a terrible situation occurred not far from here. Untamed beasts ran out of the creature control room. They were huge dogs whose entire body was engulfed in fire. That day, Wang Yulong realized that he wouldn't be able to handle everyone. Leaning on the rubble, the guy held onto his injured arm and was already ready to meet his death. The monster opened its jaws and began the final roll. But at that moment, 3 bright flames erupted in the shadows nearby. The boy had no time to realize what had happened, but in the same second, all the monsters struck by the unknown fell to the ground. Wang Yulong stared straight in front of him in horror, still unable to believe that he was still alive. Suddenly, a human voice asked him if he was okay. It was Zhu Fan. He held out his hand to the boy and asked if he could stand up. Thinking back to this situation, Wang Yulong asked his interlocutor if he could teach him his deadly techniques. Still, attack class magic spells were very difficult to master. However, Zhu Fan combined the 3 spells quite easily and released them with a single wave of his hand. Suddenly, the buddies heard 2 people on the sidelines discussing Master Zuo's lectures. They claimed that from this teacher, students could solve all their attack problems. Hearing that Mr. Zuo's ability was at an incredible level, Zhu Fan suddenly said that there was no point in attacking techniques anyway, after all, if one could defend oneself. Wang Yulong disagreed, however. The guy interrupted him and would suggest that his friend go to the relevant classes. After that, the students dispersed in different directions. Approaching the bulletin board, the protagonist began to look at the available classes on the schedule. However, in most cases, he either learned the technique or it wasn't interesting to him. But suddenly, something that Zhu Fan had never even thought of trying to do before came to Zhu Fang's eyes. It was a class called Using Healing Plants in Alchemy. The boy decided that this time he would go there. The protagonist approached the registrar's office and, after saying hello, said he wanted to sign up for a course. Explained that this program lasts 3 days and includes 10 lectures. There were only 3 places left, so the cost of the course was 50 spiritual stones. Hearing this last sentence, Zhu Fan felt very dejected. He hadn't even earned 100 stones in a year of doing the sex tasks, so he would have to give up most of his annual income. Seeing that the client hesitated, the girl explained that if one wanted to study alchemy, it was better not to even try without their course. And yet, despite the fact that the basics would be learned in the course of the program, the tutor would not reveal the individual properties of healing plants. These words once again renewed the internal contradictions in Shufang's mind. He hesitated for a long time, but then he put the crystals on the table and shouted that he was ready to pay. After the registration was over, the protagonist turned around and walked back. He still couldn't get it out of his head that he had spent 50 stones. Meanwhile, the girl twirled the crystal in her hands and laughed that they had once again easily ripped off money from naive outside students who dreamed of achieving something. Only a few people knew that going into alchemy without money was a waste of time. The sun was gradually setting over the horizon, and further events unfolded in the evening market. Walking through the barely lit neighborhoods, Zhu Fan was very nervous. Now more than ever, he hoped that his investment would pay off. Suddenly, a man shouted from behind the guy. It was Uncle Zhang. He recognized his buddy and asked if he had decided to visit little Yun. The guy waved at his acquaintance and said that he could not hide anything from him as usual. Suddenly, Uncle Zhang seriously asked when the guy was going to give the bride price. He claimed that Yun was roaring every day and asking to be released to Fang. The protagonist recalled a joking conversation with the girl. At that time, she had said that she wanted to be his wife. In turn, Zhu Fan joked that as soon as he collected the money to buy her back, they would immediately get married. However, it's been a long time since that conversation, and these people still take the joke seriously. Deciding that this conversation couldn't go any further, the protagonist waved his hand and reminded his buddy that cultivators shouldn't be among the lady for long. He wanted to ask Mr. Zhang not to talk about his coming Yun. However, the man smiled and said that he had already done so. Immediately after these words, the stomping of children's feet was heard from behind. The boy turned around and realized that he was in trouble. A girl named Yun jumped on him from behind, who shouted joyfully that her husband had finally returned. She clutched onto Shufang and shouted that she had been waiting for this for a long time. The girl's arms tightly wrapped around the boy's waist. He almost cried and asked Yun to loosen her grip. The protagonist once again tried to correct this misunderstanding, saying that he was only joking. However, the girl threateningly said that a real man does not give up his words. Yun then added that according to the traditions of their village, if the bride and groom exchange gifts as a sign of engagement, they are destined to be husband and wife until death. Immediately after saying that, she held out a bracelet to the protagonist, reminding him that it was his gift. Zhu Fan tried to explain that it was a very ordinary gift he had given to the girl to distract her. However, Yun was not going to agree to this. She hugged the guy's bodies even tighter and said that she was still his wife. Zhu Fan could barely hold back his tears at what was happening. He was already stuck here because of the stupid system, and now he had to reckon with the local strange traditions. Night was approaching as the boy headed home again. As he flew, he noticed something strange, not far from his house. Wang Yuelong stood on the ground and quickly waved his hand. He said that the guy should urgently see what he had obtained. On landing, the protagonist saw that his friend was holding one of the spiritual sheep specially bred by the sect. He asked his friend if he was sure that he was not being followed by the police, to which he replied that there was nothing to worry about, because he had paid for 1 spiritual stone. Realizing that there was nothing to worry about, Zhu Fan said that in that case, they could go in. The protagonist waved 2 fingers, and his house appeared right in front of him. Wang Yuelong stared in amazement at what had happened. The boy said that it had been a long time since he had seen semi-automatic light techniques. The student also said that Brother Su surprised him more and more every time he met him. Wang Yuelong couldn't calm down, because his friend's position in society didn't match his mastery of attack, defense, and other techniques at all. He tried to assure Xuefeng that if he hadn't shut him up, he would surely have become one of the sect leaders by now. However, the protagonist immediately ordered his interlocutor to stop and reminded him that he was going to stay quieter than water and lower than grass. The boy himself knew that he could already occupy one of the prominent positions in the sect. However, in this world, there is another principle. He who stays alive wins. So he intends to continue to lead a faded existence and not to get involved in risky stories. After passing through the gate, Fan told his friend to carry the sheep here. Wang Yuelong was surprised that they were going to roast the creature whole. It took a little more time before the victim was on the spit. Now all that was left to do was to wait for the cooking. When the sheep was ready, Wang Yuelong inhaled the smell of meat with his nose and came to a frenzied delight. The flavor and brilliance of the crispy crust was top-notch. When Wang Yuelong saw the result, he almost fainted from admiration. The food was prepared with a top-level secret technique called roast lamb. After many compliments, the student reached for his bag and began fumbling through it greedily. After a few seconds, he took out a bottle of liquid. Wang Yuelong reminded him that roast lamb without wine was like throwing away spiritual stones for nothing. The protagonist grinned, surprised that his buddy owned an all-posting pouch. He noted that one of the mentors must have liked the guy. Wang Yuelong smiled and said that this wine was worth 10 times the price of a sheep. But suddenly, Zhu Fan abruptly changed his tone and turned serious to his interlocutor. He demanded that his friend tell him what had happened, because they were unlikely to spend such sums of money on an unremarkable day. The disciple smiled and realized that he would no longer hide anything from his friend. Wang Yuelong had decided to join the combat division, and the mentor who had noticed him was from there. He said that he wouldn't be able to come here again soon, so he decided to have one last feast. He then bowed his head sadly and said that he just remembered how Shu Fan had saved his life. Pouring the wine over the rim of the glass, Wang Yuelong said that the missions of the combat branch were very dangerous. He was afraid that he would be left with only bones, or he would be wiped out, and then they would never see each other again. Grabbing the glass, the protagonist said that you can't transfer wine for such dramatic effect. After a few more minutes of discussion, the buddies sat down and tasted the lamb. After a while, only bones were left on the plate. Wang Yuelong patted his stomach and said contentedly that if he had the chance to eat food from Shu Feng, then he had not lived his life in vain. Almost immediately, the lad left the house and ran toward town, shouting that he could not be seen off and would find his own way. But suddenly, a bolt of lightning flashed brightly in the sky and flew straight at Wang Yuelong. The disciple turned around and saw 2 jade spellboards in his hand. Realizing that he had been given such a useful thing, the boy glistened with happiness. He immediately bowed to his buddy, saying he would never forget it. In response, the protagonist reminded him that the one who stays alive wins. After Wang Yuelong left, Zhu Fan's face once again became sad. He hardly had any friends here. That was why it wasn't so easy for the guy to let go of the one he was most comfortable socializing with. He sincerely hoped he wouldn't lose this tomboy. After gathering his thoughts, Shu Fan went to the garden to water the flowers. Tired, the protagonist summoned the spiritual rain technique and lay down on the chaise lounge. With Wang Yuelong gone, he could once again continue his reclusive life. He had long ago bribed the assignment officer, so he would not be in danger of traveling outside the sect's territory in the coming years. Zhu Fan planned to cultivate alchemy and cultivate spiritual rice. With this, he planned to save up money and go to lectures to learn forging. After summoning streams of refreshing air thanks to the special spring wind technique, the protagonist breathed a sigh of relief. He realized that with alchemy and forging skills, he could live happily ever after. He didn't have any more plans. However, there was still another way out of this boring life. This plan was much more appealing, but practically impossible to implement. The universe he found himself in was simply vast. Even the classical texts of the Celestial Throne sect said that there were at least several realms of celestials. They are most likely to be located in the Great Heliocosm. In that case, it could be argued that Zhu Fan was currently in the Middle Heliocosm. Here, ordinary people coexisted with those who aspired to enter the realm of celestials. There were thousands of such worlds in total. Besides, in the history of the Heavenly Throne sect, there had already been mentors who had managed to enter the celestial realm for the first time. But there was one big problem in all of this. Fang would definitely not be able to do that anytime soon. It was all the fault of this half-dead system. There was no rebirth waiting for him if he died before the day of the upper limit. So now he had to live like a mouse to grass. All the while the protagonist was pondering, he was playing with a tame spirit. At some point, he got bored with the creature and used the spell bird slaying. There was a powerful explosion behind him, but he didn't even look at it. Right now, he had created a new spell out of nothing. However, it was of no use. Zhu Fan was certain that if he exposed himself, someone would definitely kill him out of jealousy. If a guy crossed someone at the foundation stage, let alone at a higher degree of development, he wouldn't even be able to defend himself. In such a state, he would have to last a few more tens or even hundreds of years. But suddenly, an incredible idea struck Zhu Fan. He was able to develop his own disciples and pass on his own spells to them. He would have people under his command for whom the teacher's protection would be the highest value. With strong disciples, Zuifan would finally be able to stop worrying about his safety. But first, he had to reach the 12th stage of key tempering. Suddenly, the system sent an emergency alert that a scanning attempt had been detected near the area, which was successfully blocked. It was one of the few pluses of the available system. When an outsider tries to find out something about the protagonist, a false image is projected in front of him. Thanks to this, the seeker doesn't notice anything unusual. After taking out the jade slabs, Zhu Fan decided to invent another spell out of boredom. He thought of 3 abilities and decided that it would be a good idea to synthesize them into a spell called Beast Summoning. The protagonist jumped high and grabbed a sparrow flying in a flock. He needed a vessel for the long-term storage of the seized soul's activity. Any bird would do the trick. Lowering himself to the ground, Zhu Fan began preparations to invent a hybrid spell. Before the final stage, he received a sparrow that resembled clay in consistency. After the bird soul back into the body, Zhu Fan used incantations to impart hardness to the new shell and changed its composition. He ended up with a bird made entirely of ceramic. The sparrow took off and circled above its creator for a while. The result looked good. It remained to be seen whether such a trick would work on a werewolf. But suddenly the bird tried to swoop down on the protagonist, and not calculating the weight, crashed on his forehead. Zhu Fan thought that this was a dead end. He decided to accept failure and thought that when alchemy started to bring in money, he would try to buy a normal vessel. In this world of spiritless stones, one can't even take a step. Meanwhile, Wang Yuelong was on a mission in the forest outside the sect's territory. He looked fearfully in front of him, unable to believe the result. Then the guy raised his head and laughed loudly. He had once again managed to defeat his opponent with just one blow. This time, Brother Zhu had given him an even cooler spell. It wasn't even clear what level this ability was. Meanwhile, not far from this place, the mentor was walking with his prey in his hand. He hoped that their newcomer would not be eaten by any beast, or else all responsibility would fall back on him. Reaching the meeting place, the former fighter could not believe his eyes. In front of him, a dead lynx lay on the ground with a long, glowing rod sticking out of its forehead. The newcomer stood beside it with a nonchalant look. The old hunter dropped his prey in surprise. He asked in bewilderment, wondering if the boy had finished him off with one move. He wondered if the boy had killed him with one move. This is what the rank system looked like in this organization. A combat unit divides fighters into 4 ranks, A, B, C, D. The lowest ranked fighters are not fit for anything. C rank holders are treated as cannon fodder. Category B soldiers are the main fighting force, and only A rank holders are the elite of the entire organization. Mentors are personally involved in their development. These people are given the best of everything. Wang Yuelong stared at his mentor intently and then asked what was wrong with his face. The former fighter said that he was fine, but still a little shocked. It was surprising that a rookie was able to straighten out a beast at the 6th stage of key tempering. Normally, such qualities were of rank B and above, but even to obtain the best category, one had to prove themselves some more. To do so, one had to kill 10 beasts at the 7th key tempering stage. The mentor assured the newcomer that he would have more than one more chance to prove himself. However, the boy's face showed that he was disappointed. The mentor then said that he hoped Wang Yuelong wouldn't forget about him when he became a rank A fighter. The disciple thanked the attendant for recommending him and said that his memory was fine. After a while, Wang Yuelong finally saw Shuifan. The protagonist asked what was so strange about killing a 6th step beast with a single blow. He gave his friend the Fire Peak spell. The peculiarity of this skill is that it slows down your heartbeat just before you throw it. This was what helped it hit the target accurately. Therefore, it would be strange if Wang Yuelong didn't kill the opponent with a single strike. The apprentice admired his friend's insight and again suggested that he join the combat squad. He explained that with Fang's skills, he would be immediately assigned to a rank A squad. He would become a favorite of his mentors, and that was a direct path to greatness. But the protagonist once again refused, adding this time that he does not like to kill. In addition, the risks of dying himself would be greatly increased. And even the high rank did not cancel the fact that the position of fighters in society is lower than that of masters, alchemy, and forging. Zhu Fan thought that if he were to reach the peak of the key tempering stage, he would not be able to break through to the next stage until the designated time. At best, he would be considered a hopeful person, until at some point he would be despised for staying in the same place for so long. Wang Yulong asked, wasn't the ability to instill terror in the hearts of others a dream for any man? He was confident that Brother Zhu, with his talents, would eventually be able to ascend to the celestial realm and become the 39th honorable ancestor of the Heavenly Throne sect. That being said, it was clear that Wang Yuelong also wanted to ascend there as a disciple. According to the rules of this world, if an almighty cultivator could endure the heavenly test, he would be allowed to take 2 disciples with him. The protagonist looked at his interlocutor in bewilderment and asked why he wanted to go to the realm of the Celestials. He was sure that life there was much worse than here. Wang Yuelong objected, saying that getting to the realm of the Celestials was the dream of any cultivator. Shu Fan looked at his interlocutor indifferently and said that it was only a goal for him. The guy prepared to use the ability and thought that he probably wouldn't want to live in the higher realm and die of boredom either. In the next second, he cut the meat carcass in half with one easy movement, which once again surprised his friend very much. Shu Fan told Wang Yuelong to eat more meat, because it was very beneficial for the 6th stage of tempering. Suddenly, the boy asked his strong friend if he wanted to take him on as an apprentice. However, the protagonist was not impressed by this prospect. He asked his interlocutor whether he had gone completely crazy and animal fat had clogged his brains. Swallowing another piece of meat, Wang Yuelong said that he came from a lineage of small-grade cultivators. Right now, one member of their family was at the golden elixir stage. However, he then added that one of his ancestors had even reached the spirit birth stage. The protagonist asked in bewilderment what all these stories were about. The guy replied that their clan was now in decline, but thanks to the travel notes left behind by those ancestors, the family members traditionally had a broad outlook. Feiyu belonged to the middle Chiliocosm, and the realm of the Celestials belonged to the Great Realm. Suddenly, Wang Yuelong's face darkened, and he admitted that his friend was right, and the realm of the Celestials was indeed a cruel place. Their sect territory is located in one of the poorest regions of the world, and the central continent is considered the promised land for every cultivator. That is where hundreds of the strongest sects are located with disciples at the spirit birth stage and above. However, as was usually the case, even among the strongest, there were the best. The Heavenly Arrow sect is one of them. It is said to be the strongest organization in the world. Fan pretended to lazily sip his wine, but this information surprised him. He really didn't expect that his friend could have such serious knowledge in this area. Wang Yuelong added that the cultivators of the central continent had studied all the techniques and spells to their essence, and were now in the business of combining old techniques and creating new ones. Such people are called spellcasters. In terms of their status in society, they stand far above any masters. Wang Yuelong added that his ancestor had personally visited the Heavenly Arrow sect's guests. Therefore, based on his records, it could be said that Brother Shu had all the data to become a spellcaster. Wang Yuelong fell to his knees once again and started begging for his friend to take him on as a disciple. The guy claimed that there was surely no one in their sect capable of creating attack spells that could strike a beast 2 steps higher. Suddenly, a blue light flashed in the protagonist's hand. He lifted his interlocutor into the air with a light wind. However, Wang Yuelong was not frightened, and on the contrary, he was even more delighted. Fan said to his friend not to even dream of becoming his disciple. The guy is already over 18 and his time has passed for that. But in fact, an interesting thought did creep into the main character's mind. What if he really did become a spellcaster? Surely his talent would be enough for that. Seeing 2 fingers pointed straight at his forehead, Wang Yuelong was truly frightened for the first time. For a moment, he thought that his buddy had decided to kill him as an unnecessary witness. After that, The hand slowly reached up to touch the guy's forehead. Wang Yuelong cried and shouted that he promised to keep his friend's potential a secret, and then asked him not to kill him. Fortunately, his friend said that he would not kill anyone because he did not want to make a fuss about the unknown disappearance of a cult disciple. All this problem can be solved legally. Zhu Fan took his fingers away from his buddy's head, and then the memory editing ability was applied to his brain. The boy's gaze immediately faded, and he asked his friend where he stood. The protagonist replied that Wang Yuelong was talking about how he wanted to become a rank A fighter. The disciple said that was exactly what he meant, and then asked his interlocutor to teach him a few more interesting techniques. Fan smiled and said that he would be happy to help his friend. A little more time passed, and the buddies fell asleep outside, having had enough meat and drunk wine. The next day, Fan rushed to write down everything he remembered. This world was much more complicated than he had imagined. It turned out that his sect wasn't even close to being among the strongest. In addition, he had also learned about the spellcasters, although it was logical that skills couldn't appear on their own, and someone created them. The only thing that remained unclear was how far the central continent was from its current location, and what dangers could be encountered on the way there. But more than anything else, the boy wondered about something else. He couldn't figure out if he needed all of this. For now, Fong didn't see the point of going there. After thinking about it, he decided to take a day off and not train. Lying on the bench and chewing on a blade of grass, Fong frustratingly thought that if he had a computer with internet access here, being a lifelong sage wouldn't be so boring. In all this time, which seemed to last endlessly, he was already tired of clearing his mind and taming his desires. Suddenly, the boy heard an incredible rumble in the sky. When he looked out from under the canopy, he saw a ship of incredible size flying over his plot. It was a sailing vessel about 500 meters long. It was escorted on all sides by about 100 sentries at the Golden Elixir stage. Each of them flew on their own Firebird. In addition, there were smaller ships on the sides, about 300 meters each. The expedition was of an incredible scale, so it was logical to assume that they were heading for resource extraction. Xue Fan smiled and thought that when he learned forging, he would have his own ship. Suddenly, the system alerted about an intruder in the territory. The protagonist snapped his fingers, hoping that it was Wang Yuelong who had come again. His settlement returned to a state of visibility, and nearby, Fong actually saw his friend. He asked the guy what he was doing here, and shouldn't he be on a mission. However, Wang Yuelong did not answer the questions. He only limped and walked into the property. Only then did the protagonist notice that his leg was bloody. The newly minted fighter replied that he was injured while on a mission, so he had to take a few days off to recover, and he only came here because he wants to spend all this time with his friend. Fan angrily said as he gave Wang Yuelong the body relief spell. However, the protagonist quickly realized that his buddy had once again decided to go rogue. The boy scratched the back of his head and bashfully said that that beast had a strong defense, and only with strong spells could it be broken through. So he decided to go head-on again. Fang looked sternly at his talentless arc and said that his skills were irredeemably lousy. He once again began to teach his interlocutor that when fighting a stronger opponent, one should step back, take a stance, and use a long-range spell. Fang then asked if the guy had also forgotten about defense techniques. Wang Yuelong replied that in the heat of battle, he decided not to use them. He then affectionately asked his friend what to do with a beast that had strong defense and fast speed. The protagonist seriously replied that the boy should not seek answers to this question from a person who is a homebody and does not go out. After that, a tense silence hung in the air. Fan realized that it was impossible to get his martial prowess into someone's head. Wang Yuelong wanted his friend to stop pretending and finally realized that no mentor would teach him the same thing. The guy said that Brother Shu should stop pretending to know nothing. It was clear to Wang Yuelong that the protagonist was hiding his talents from others for some reason. But he knew what his friend was capable of. At some point, Fang gave up and said that he would tell him how to deal with such beasts. But in return, Wang Yuelong had to tell him all about the flying ships that had recently passed by. The boy said that he liked this exchange. The protagonist rose from his seat and muttered that in that case they had better start with his part of the agreement. He immediately swiftly swung his hand, and both boys were transported into empty subspace. Wang Yuelong stared at the strange illusion in a daze, unable to believe that this was only possible using a charm technique. Surely creating such a subspace would require the spiritual energy of all the disciples of the sect. Zhu Fan said that a friend would do a training battle right now. He also added that his spiritual energy would not be enough to maintain the illusion for a long time, so one should start now. Trailing off, Fan snapped his fingers, adding that Wang Yuelong would now face a fast beast with good defense. A second later, a stone mantis that had a 7th stage key tempering appeared in front of the newly minted warrior. The monster immediately pounced on his opponent, and the protagonist shouted that his friend had 15 minutes, after which they would analyze the flaws in his tactics. The boy fearfully dodged the first blow, complaining that he hadn't even been warned about the start of the fight. He immediately decided to counterattack using the feather lightness and fire peak skills. However, the mantis dodged the daggers flying at it without any difficulty. Such speed amazed the disciple. He didn't expect this monster to be so fast. That's when the protagonist said that the friend moves at a good speed, but releases the spades very slowly. The very next second after that, the mantis was right behind the fighter's back. Fong sighed and said that this was kindergarten level. The monster grabbed the man with its claws and tossed him far aside. The guy struggled to get to his feet, shaking his whole body. The protagonist asked his friend what he was constantly distracted by. However, Wang Yuelong did not answer, and the fight continued. After 15 minutes, there were more cuts on the student's body. He looked down at his feet, not knowing what to say about it. Shu Fan said that Wang Yuelong had lost the bout with almost no chance. The boy completely lacked the ability to observe his opponent, notice his habits, and predict his movements. Abruptly putting 2 fingers to his friend's head, Fang said that every creature has its own habits, regardless of whether it was a human or a monster. That's why you need to understand one simple truth during combat. To defeat a fast beast, you must use a spell that seals its movements. You can only do this if you understand how your opponent is moving. If the fighter is at least a little attentive, he will understand exactly where to hit. Only if the boy could analyze the enemy's actions, the mantis wouldn't have been able to dodge those peaks. After the miss, Wang Yuelong's movements became jittery and frantic. Already at this moment, he had already lost. During the fight, the beast managed to dodge 4 attacks, but even that wasn't enough for the boy to understand the enemy's movements. Meanwhile, Wang Yuelong marveled that his friend's illusion skill was so excellent that he could still feel the pain from the blows he had received in the fight with the mantis. He could not understand how Fang managed to hold the illusion and watch the fight at the same time. The guy rushed to his interlocutor and said that he realized that it wasn't all of his faults. However, the protagonist said that they were, but for now, they needed to focus on fixing what had already been pointed out. At the end, he added that if he had time in the future, he was willing to teach his friend something else. Zuifan smiled and thought that he had wanted to say this phrase at the right moment for a long time. After that, the protagonist made himself comfortable on the bench. He reminded him that it was now Wang Yuelong's turn to fulfill his part of the bargain and tell him about those flying ships. The student suggested moving to a more relaxing place. Then both boys sat down on the chaise lounges. After that, Wang Yuelong said that it was worth listening more carefully because the history of this ship was very ancient. 500 years ago, the Supreme Preceptor gathered all of the sect's possessions and traveled to the central continent to order the construction of a ship. For the sake of this moment, their organization had not accepted any new members for 50 years because it was struggling to feed itself. Some members of the sect went mad at the sight of the spiritual stones. The life of the organization began to get better only after the built ship arrived at the site. From that moment on, the sect was considered a serious force. The protagonist asked if the organization had been preparing for war all this time. Wang Yuelong replied that it was all for the sake of resources. Half of the area of this world is covered by the so-called Great Sea. It is believed that the amount of resources there is as vast as the sea itself. In addition, it is believed that there are valuable treasures hidden in the depths, which in principle are not found on land. But at the same time, the Great Sea is extremely dangerous. It cannot be explored with only sturdy warriors. Therefore, a flying ship is needed to be able to search for resources. This is due to the fact that from the depths sometimes rise monsters of incredible size. Only by having a flying ship, there is a chance to fend off their attacks. If the civilization relied only on the resources available on land, the development of most students would end at the stage of the golden elixir. In addition, some enthusiasts say that on a flying ship, you can not only sail through the sea or air, but even go beyond the celestial horizon. Shufan looked closely at the sun and thought that his interlocutor was talking about space. The boy said that rumor has it that only the highest level sects do this sort of thing. Their organization is content to travel the great sea. The protagonist nodded his head meaningfully. The thought immediately came to him that possessing such a ship in this world was akin to possessing a nuclear weapon. It was these mysterious devices that determined the sect's position in the world and were the powerhouses of the sect. Suddenly, Shufan asked his friend if there was any option to get on the ship and inspect it. Wang Yulong confirmed this, but then added that only 4 types of people are allowed on board. First and foremost, they are experts in research spells. They determine the ship's route. Then, there are the guards of the combat section. As a rule, they are fighters of rank A. Following them are masters of alchemy and forging. During the expedition, they are responsible for the primary processing of the extracted raw materials. The last type is the commander of a ship in the Void Mastery stage, who is well versed in all areas of martial and scientific arts. Therefore, from Wang Yuelong's words, it is not difficult for Fang to enter the ship. All he needs to do is to become a rank A fighter after reaching the Golden Elixir stage and get into the guard squad. It would be much harder to get into other positions, unless one became an alchemy or forging master of the 3rd grade or higher. The protagonist sighed heavily. For the Golden Elixir stage, he would have to live for another few hundred years without dying. And it took an incredible amount of money to become a master of alchemy or forging. At this moment, Wang Yuelong once again asked Brother Shu to go with him to the battle station. The protagonist said he wasn't interested, and added that he wanted to learn how to build his own ship. Wang Yuelong was surprised that his friend had decided to take a swing at such purchases. He reminded him that even if he sold all the rice he had grown, he wouldn't be able to pay for his introductory forging course. Shufan said that in that case, he would have to stop feeding his buddy. The very next day, the protagonist came to the alchemy study halls. He thought for the first time that if he had studied as much in his previous life, his parents would have died of happiness. Fan looked resolutely at the front door. All he had wanted for the past few years was to find a way to go back. As he got closer, the guy said hello to the girl and introduced himself. Then the main character said that he wanted to enroll in a course called Pill-Making Techniques. The receptionist replied that this program costs 500 spirit stones and 100 merit points. At the same time, the cost of the 2nd year is paid in the same way. The student will have 2 days off per month. Upon graduation, there is an opportunity to join the alchemy department. Zhu Fan gave the 1st year's fee with a pain in his heart. Judging from the rates, it was a brazen and shameless robbery. After accepting the payment, the girl asked the newcomer to follow her. After passing through the main gate, Fan admiringly looked around the large open space. Now he could see where all the money paid by the trainees was going. Looking at all of this, the girl realized that people like him never even made it out of their village. She sincerely didn't understand why people like that would go into alchemy. After that, the girl disdainfully handed the newcomer a token and not sincerely wished him to become a master. However, Fan decided to ignore this attitude and thanked the receptionist. A large number of people turned out in the classrooms. Suddenly, the guy smelled a pleasant aroma coming from somewhere in the depths of the room. At the same moment, a beautiful girl approached him. She said hello and asked him if this was the first lesson for the boy. At the sight of her, Fang instantly blushed. He had heard legends about this girl. The protagonist gathered himself and introduced himself, asking for the name of his interlocutor. The girl carefully fixed her hair and said that her name was Sha Yan. She also explained that she only teaches here when her father can't show up for class. Fan mumbled something inaudible, and Yan asked him if something had happened. The guy scratched the back of his head in embarrassment and said it was fine. It was just that now he was wondering how he could catch up with those who had been practicing for a long time. Shayan laughed and said that her students had already managed to learn some basics. She then took out a jade tablet with the past materials and offered the new student a one-on-one study session after lunch. After that, the girl said that it was already time to start the lesson. She smiled and asked the boy to listen to her especially attentively. After Sha Yan left, Zhu Fan grabbed his heart. He thought that the plot was developing at a risky pace. In addition, the main character thought that he had seen a movie somewhere that started the same way. Evening came, and the boy went to the place where they had agreed to meet his teacher. The girl sat down in front of him and asked if he was ready to start practicing. However, the protagonist kept his eyes on her, not understanding how one could concentrate on alchemy in such a situation. One single look from her killed any desire to learn in him. Shachin smiled and said that they would go through the methods of the initial processing of the spirit plants, as it was a very important part of knowledge in alchemy. It was what would determine the quality of the pills created. Zhu Fan stared at her like a mesmerized man and listened to every word. This was how he had embarked on the path of learning alchemy. Besides, with such a teacher, learning would not be boring. A month had already passed since that very first day. As it turned out, alchemy is a very tricky business. It was only now that the protagonists began to make their first test potions. Putting the ingredients into the vat, he used fire control and energy control to heat up the fire. After the bowl got hotter, Fan piled the remaining ingredients into it and closed the lid. After a while, he looked inside to see what was going on. Beautiful blue and green bubbles were rising up from the bowl. Slamming the lid shut, he thought, this is an easy one after all. But in the next second, the vat exploded, showering the protagonist's face with fumes. As an excuse, Zhu Fan thought that even geniuses sometimes had their cauldrons explode. Immediately, the guy looked fearfully at the bowl that was worth a lot of money. At that moment, he wished more than anything that such an incident would not happen again. Zhu Fan carefully inspected the cauldron from different sides for damage. However, all the walls were in normal condition. On one of the bevels, he did find a large crack. The protagonist immediately remembered what he had been told about it. This type of bowl could withstand a maximum of 10 explosions, so it had to be used with care. He also knew that it took about 20 cauldrons to make the first pill, 50 to develop his own, 100 to become an alchemist, and 1,000 to become a mentor. It is not without reason that they say it is not for the poor. But immediately, Zhu Fan thought that geniuses like him shouldn't be subject to such rules. He unrestrainedly began experimenting with various substances. However, the situation only worsened. A couple minutes later, the boiler exploded for the third time. Thus, there were about 7 attempts left before a new purchase. This time, however, he finally got something. After a few experiments, the protagonist figured out how to work with it. If the next batch was also successful, after deducting the costs, it would bring him 17.5 spirit stones, which was about 600% profit. This was an order of magnitude more profitable than completing sect assignments. This was how he realized that he was on the right path. Zhu Fan clenched his fists and decided that if he was going to do this, he should keep working. The next day, the protagonist came to the study halls. A professor named Sha Jintian, who was a core course instructor, recalled that yesterday he had assigned students to prepare a nutritional pill. He then asked who had done well in this task. As it turned out, no one was able to do it. The professor laughed and said that it was obvious from the faces of the newcomers that they had blown up more than one cauldron and had not prepared the pills. Still, he calmed the students and said that everything has its time. The newbies immediately started talking about how they almost killed themselves yesterday, and someone even blew up 2 whole woks. However, of all the listeners, it was Fan who caught the professor's attention. The boy became nervous, not understanding why Sha Jintian was staring at him so intently. Suddenly, the professor formed a noise screen and asked his daughter if she knew the student named Shufan well. Yan replied that he was the most ordinary-looking student who kept himself modest and didn't stand out in any way. Sha Jintian explained that this young man was not as simple as he wanted to appear. He asked his daughter to pay more attention to this student from now on. Upon entering the classroom, the professor immediately sensed that this boy had the scent of a ready-made pill coming from him. The girl asked what it was for. Covering up his true thoughts, the professor said that he thought this student had great potential. Sha Jintian also added that if his suspicions were confirmed, he would take the young man for personal study. Later that day, Zhu Fan was experimenting with pills at home. His cauldron still had 6 explosions to endure, so he had to try not to ruin it until he had money for a new one. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, the protagonist saw a house appear out of nowhere on a mountain not far from him. He went outside and looked around. It wasn't clear why anyone would move to such a remote area and settle on a mountain. Suddenly, the guy saw something approaching him at high speed from the side of the house. When the object was right next to his face, Zhu Fan couldn't believe his eyes. It was Wei Yun who had ended up here for some unknown reason. She flew into the protagonist at high speed, knocking out all of his organs. Zhu Fan lifted the girl up with trembling hands and asked what she was doing here. Yun added that she just wanted to check on her husband and added that she had already reached the 4th stage of key tempering. To demonstrate this, she jumped up again and smoothly flew into the air. Zhu Fan looked at it skeptically, not understanding whether she was showing off her cultivation or flaunting her skirt. Yun hugged the guy again, saying that the mentor had come upon a rare spirituality in her. He wanted to take her on as an apprentice, but she refused. The protagonist laughed and praised her. Suddenly, the girl said that she had flown here at the request of her father, who was still continuing to ransom her. Zhu Fan frowned and said that it was good news. The guy said it was late and Yun probably hadn't eaten in a while. He said he could cook something and the girl agreed. After that, the protagonist started making different dishes in hopes that Yun would get full and leave. Some time passed and the table was filled with various delicious food. But the main place was occupied by a large plate of spiritual rice. In the process, Zhu Fan said that he had wanted to talk about the topic of marriage jokes for a long time. He explained to the girl that she was like a little sister to him. The main character said that choosing a fiancé is the most important decision in any girl's life. However, he is hardly suitable for this role. After saying those words, Yun paused for a few seconds before bringing her wand to her mouth. Suddenly, her hands trembled. Immediately afterward, tears began to drip from her eyes into the rice bowl. Yun started crying and screaming that her husband didn't need her anymore. Such an effective mixture of female and child manipulation Zhu Fan had not expected at all. After that, long hours of trying to calm the girl down dragged on. The protagonist was still trying to bring the girl to her senses and talk to her like an adult. However, she only screamed that her husband was leaving her. On the 3rd hour of futile persuasion, the guy yelled out that no one was going to give up on her. Yun finally calmed down a bit. Sobbing, she asked if Zhu Fan was really still her husband. The protagonist again tried to clarify this point, but the child did not let him say a word and burst into tears again. Tired of this endless shouting, Zhu Fan said that he would pay this ransom. Hearing this, Yun instantly calmed down and abruptly reached for her wands. She immediately continued eating as if nothing had happened, saying she would remember those words, and adding that the food had already gotten a little cold. The boy stared indignantly at the cunning child and asked who had taught her such manipulation. Yun said that she did not know what it was about. After saying this, Zhu Fan started screaming and tearing his hair. The girl embarrassedly mouthed that she really wanted them to be husband and wife. She then looked meaningfully at the protagonist, waiting for his reaction. Zhu Fan realized that this was another manipulation. However, this time he simply decided to accept it and sighed heavily. He immediately stroked Yun's head, deciding to let things be as they were. Several days passed like this. Yun continued to live with him. From time to time, the girl also cooked something on her own. She was very fond of treating her fiancé. However, the latter still continued to treat it as a formality. Suddenly, there was a bright blue flash on the horizon. In a second, a huge blue bird appeared right above the main character's house. A beautiful girl in a gray dress sat on it. The protagonist looked greedily at the visitor, hoping she had arrived just for him. In the same second, her gaze fell on Zhu Fan, and he finally understood everything. Zhu Fan thought that the system had finally decided to give him a gift, out of pity for him. A beautiful female mentor at home would never be out of place. Suddenly, another voice greeted the Honorable and asked what she needed in these lands. The mentor explained that she wanted to take someone with her. The voice asked if her target was in the Heavenly Throne sex territory, and the girl confirmed it. The next second, a huge blue flower rose up at Yun, who nonchalantly continued to chew on the watermelon. The mentor asked if the girl wanted to become her mentee. Suddenly, a voice asked if the Venerable had come here to take their man from these lands. It was the sex border guardian. He claimed that although the girl was a heavenly spirit bearer, she was not worth the attention of other organizations. But suddenly, the woman looked angrily at the guard and said that their fates were linked, and she would take this child anyway. After that, the mentor turned to Yun, saying that she was willing to accept the girl as her personal disciple. The woman explained that she was skilled in training methods for the development of celestial spirit bearers and would take her subordinate all the way to the celestial realm. The child honestly said that she didn't even know if she wanted it or not. Hearing this, Zhu Fan was furious because the girl was missing an opportunity that might not come again. Suddenly, Yun turned to the protagonist and asked him how she should proceed. The guy was immediately stared at with suspicious looks. At the same moment, everyone present started using the divine consciousness ability to check him. It was a serious technique they could use to reveal his intentions. At the same time, there was a pleasant odor coming from the mentor, and the guard was trying to do something incomprehensible. In the end, Zhu Fan gathered his thoughts and exhaled heavily. He turned to Yun and said that this was a great chance that was surely worth taking. Under this kind of observation, he couldn't say anything else. On the other hand, it was a great chance to quietly dump his little wife. Lastly, the girl asked if she could visit her husband. She confirmed this and said that her methods did not involve taking a vow of celibacy and that she was not in the habit of prying into her students' private lives. In addition, she claimed that if a heavenly spirit bearer chose someone, then that person was also special. Yun said that in that case, she would do as her husband told her to do. The guard said he accepted the decision and congratulated them. The woman then put the girl on the bird with a slight wave of her hand and said she was taking her right away. The huge creature and the guard immediately scattered in different directions. Zuefan exhaled, happy that he was finally alone. There were a large number of pumped-up masters in this world. The protagonist noticed that he was constantly getting visitors who were stronger than him. After lying on the ground for a while, he decided that although he was stuck at the key tempering stage, it was no reason to lie around. For example, it was possible to pump the techniques of the 5 elements. The book of the same name was on trend, which meant that the guy had bought it for a reason, but suddenly the system alerted again about the trespasser of the site. A tall, pumped-up man with swarthy skin entered the property. Shu Fan was startled, but he soon recognized this man as Wang Yuelong. He asked his friend if he had spent a month in the primeval forest. The apprentice grinned and explained that he had gone hunting in a very distant forest, where he only killed beasts of a level higher than himself. In the end, he managed to finish off as many as 8 of them. According to the sex assignment, he still had 2 more specific beasts to kill, but this task was too difficult for him. The protagonist realized that his friend had been through quite a lot in the past month. Wang Yulong said that every day he was on the verge of life and death. The 2 friends lay down on the chaise lounges again. The young fighter wanted to ask his friend for advice on how to finish off the remaining 2 beasts. When asked if he had met them, the lad replied that he had already managed to enter the fray, but had almost died there. The protagonist said he wanted a full description of these beasts. With a yawn, Wang Yulong narrated that the first was an earthbender. This monster had an unusual defense technique. When it realized that danger was approaching, it would immediately burrow underground. If one didn't finish off this creature within a couple of moments, there would be no more chances. The second was a blood cat. This monster was so fast that its habits were impossible to see. From the first throw, it almost gave Wang Yuelong a fatal wound. The guy asked his friend how he would do if he were in his shoes. Xu Fan got angry at his interlocutor because instead of progress, he just comes to nag for an answer. And then the protagonist decided to teach the careless fighter a lesson. He said that he has a technique that allows him to kill any creature with a single blow. Moreover, this skill was quite simple and consisted of just one move. Wang Yulong's eyes lit up, and he asked to urgently teach it to him. Xu Fan narrated that this technique was invented by a great thinker and master, and he only obtained it by luck. He then said he was readily available to show how it worked. The protagonist transported the 2 guys into subspace. He explained that he would now create 2 mantises containing the qualities described by Wang Yuelong. A second later, one of the monsters attacked Fang from the rear. However, he didn't even turn around and said that he would demonstrate how to use this technique to kill without looking. Before Wang Yuelong knew it, the protagonist swung his hand sharply and made a huge hole in the mantis's chest. While the young martial artist was stunned at what had happened, Zuefan said that no defense would save him from this ability. Wang Yulong's facial expression did not have time to change, but at the same instant, another mantis ran up to him from behind. At a great speed, it brought its claws to the guy's neck, preparing to cut it. However, the young fighter didn't even have time to realize anything before a green slurry suddenly poured down on him. When he looked back, he saw Xu Fan standing in front of him. The protagonist quickly covered the distance and destroyed the second praying mantis with a single blow. Waving his head toward his defeated foe, he said he only needed a couple moments to straighten out his target. Wang Yuelong started begging his friend to share this technique with him. Fan said that he would love to help, but it takes a lot of time and battles to learn this skill well. Expectedly, the guy asked if there was another way to learn it faster. The protagonist coughed and said that the ancient sage who invented the technique had indeed spoken of there being such a way. Making a serious face and struggling to contain his laughter, Fan mouthed the need to shave his head. He explained that that master had claimed that the day after, it would be easier for the disciple to apply the skill. This all sounded very strange, and Wang Yulong expectedly started to hesitate. However, the protagonist said that he wasn't going to insist. He was going to give the skill to his friend. This ability allowed you to hit the enemy's weakest point precisely, ahead of them by several moments. However, it was logical that such knowledge could not be free. After a while, Wang Yulong abruptly jumped to his feet and shouted through his tears that he agreed. The protagonist paused for a moment, making the young fighter tense. He was only laughing at the fact that he was about to see something amazing. For a few minutes, Wang Yulong's head was completely clear of hair. The smooth, light bald spot shone brightly in the sun. Barely containing his laughter, the protagonist told his friend that he was finally one step closer to becoming stronger. But judging by the boy's face, he wasn't very happy about it. Suddenly, he asked why Brother Zhu was so strong, yet his hair was still in place. Fang hesitated, however, then said that he simply did not seek to become even stronger. To avoid even more unnecessary questions, the protagonist sent his friend home to practice and refine his technique. Walking out of the house, Wang Yulong thought for a moment that this was really how it should be. Zhu Fan didn't think that his buddy would fall for it so easily. However, there was no time for jokes now. Thanks to alchemy, the protagonist planned to accumulate enough money to learn forging. 3 whole months had already passed since that day. Further events took place somewhere far away in some sacred place. Mary Yun saddled the bird and ordered it to fly forward. However, the creature immediately stopped when it heard the voice of its mistress. She asked her apprentice if she was already tempted to fly away. At this point, the girl had still not mastered the Heaven's Mandate techniques, and her skills still left much to be desired. The woman explained that she was not going to let Yun go at this stage. In addition, she had also ended up here as a heavenly spirit bearer back in the day. Still, in spite of all the strictness, the mentor realized that looking back over her years, she must be pleased with her students' progress. Their training would have been at a much more measured pace if it weren't for that scary dream. It had been a long time, and the warrior still couldn't forget it. She was sure that it was a warning from a heavenly spirit, a warning of impending danger. Stroking her disciple's head, the woman thought that she was really asking too much of her. However, Yun was the one who could stop the coming disaster. But the girl said she wanted to take a little walk, for the training had taken all her strength away. It would be even more wonderful if she could see her husband. The mentor was sure that the heavenly spirit would not allow the chosen girl to choose the most ordinary man. And if she was so attached to him, it meant that he had a great future ahead of him. The woman allowed a walk, but she had to refrain from traveling to her husband's house for the time being. She promised that when the student had mastered the techniques of the celestial mandate to an intermediate level, they could talk about a date. Parallel events were developing in the forging training rooms. Upon entering the classroom, the protagonist was literally blinded by the bright glow emanating from the classroom. Looking around, he found that almost all of the students had shaved heads. It was also there that Shu Fan caught one of the guys talking to his buddies. The disciple said that he had been told about this method by a friend from the martial arts department. From the description of this person, the protagonist realized that he was talking about Wang Yulong. He'd seen people like this in the alchemy halls before, and now the fashion had reached forging classes. Amazingly, this dumbass had managed to get almost all the students of the Outer Lands hooked on this cheap prank. Indeed, after a short time, most of the disciples of the Heavenly Throne sect shaved their heads. This phenomenon went down in the history of the organization as bald madness. Meanwhile, Shu Fan was diligently familiarizing himself with a beginner's self-tutorial on the basics of forging. Unexpectedly, it turned out that the threshold of entry into this art was much higher than that of alchemy. The protagonist spent 10,000 spiritual stones, and in the end, he had to study everything himself. While returning home, Shu Fan suddenly saw a man named Pang Fu. The boy asked the acquaintance what he was doing in his neighborhood. A sect disciple, who only needed to know that his parents were very rich, immediately recognized Brother Shui. The guy explained that he had heard rumors about the main character's success in alchemy. Fu decided to congratulate his friend on this and give him some spirit stones. However, Fang tried to refuse, saying that he didn't have to gift anything. However, the fatty stood his ground, saying that outer disciples were still like lonely wanderers with no one to take care of them, so there was no need to refuse the rare gifts of fate. The protagonist studied with this boy until he reached the key tempering stage. With his sudden appearance, Fu reminded him that there weren't many people in this world that he could call buddies. However, the question remained as to why the boy had decided to be so generous. After asking what actually happened, the sect disciple decided to get straight to the point. Fu said that the fact is that the outer disciples have nothing to rely on in the sect because no one cares about them. Therefore, their destiny is to get pennies for doing the tasks of the organization. That's why the fat man wanted the outer disciples to unite. Pan Fu explained that they could share resources and information with each other and solve complex problems together. He argued that the emergence of such an association would make their lives much easier. The protagonist grinned, ironically saying that the fat man among them had the hardest life. Very easy to say to someone who comes from a rich merchant family that is cooler than any of the great warrior houses. Fu was surprised and asked how the guy knew about it. In reality, the protagonist once received a handout from a fat man. That's when he noticed the characteristic family ring on his index finger. Nevertheless, Xu Fan replied that he had caught a glimpse of the entourage that Fu came with when he joined the sect. He then asked if the interlocutor wanted to form a semblance of an alliance. Noticing that his colleague was living quite well since he had spiritual tea, the fat man said that he wanted to gather 1,000 outer disciples at the same stage who could help each other. The protagonist said that he was interested, however, he wanted to know his benefit. Fu explained that, first of all, the guy would get first-hand news of the sect. Secondly, he will gain useful connections. Among the outer disciples, there are many who would like to try their hand at alchemy, but they don't have the money to study, so they've been serving masters for years. Since the fame of Xu Fang's success has been around for a long time, he would be able to help the more backward disciples develop. In addition, they already had 40 candidates to join the battle squad, 2 promising alchemists and 1 apprentice forging master. Fu assured that they only needed to persuade Xu Fang to start blossoming. Realizing that this conversation would not just end, the protagonist agreed to help. The fat man smiled and said that he didn't expect any other answer. He then placed a blue ball in front of his interlocutor. Fan asked what it was, to which Fu replied that it was some sort of communication device. They were made by the same apprentice of the forging master. With this ball, the protagonist will receive the latest news of the alliance. Fu then handed the jade plaques to his ally and said that they would also be useful in the future. After that, the fat man said goodbye to his friend and said that they would see each other very soon. But no sooner had Xu Fan turned around than he suddenly felt that there was someone behind him. Suddenly, a female voice asked the guy if he had just received guests. The protagonist turned around frightened and saw Sha Yan in front of him. He said that he had only recently had a buddy visit him. The girl asked the disciple why he got nervous in such a case. After the recent conversation, the guy realized that the last person he wanted to meet at this moment was Sha Yan. At the same time, he was annoyed that he could only see girls like this on the internet before, but now he had to avoid them. The teacher asked the student if she could come in. A short while later, they were both sitting at a table in the courtyard, while Fang poured tea into mugs. During this time, the girl had been having intrusive thoughts. It had been going on ever since her father had ordered her to pay more attention to this student. Now it seemed to her that the simple observation was beginning to grow into something more. Turning around, Sha Yan slapped her cheeks and thought that she shouldn't get distracted and forget the purpose of her visit. Then she slapped her hand sharply on the table, which startled the protagonist a bit. The girl leaned toward Fang, who was at a loss for words at the same moment. The teacher asked her student in a gentle voice why he had suddenly decided to leave the alchemy department. The guy didn't answer anything, and there was silence in the air. Realizing that she had phrased the question wrongly, Sha Yan decided to ask in a different way. She asked Xu Fan why he didn't want to become her father's disciple. At some point, Sha Jintian became convinced of the young apprentice's talent and decided to take him on as an apprentice. However, as a result, the boy unexpectedly refused. None of them knew that in fact the protagonist studied alchemy only to make pills for sale. all this was done in order to earn the tuition to learn forging. This was doubly insulting to alchemists, as masters of these two arts look up to each other. Realizing this, Fan explained that he loved freedom and alchemy was only a source of income for him. Sha Yan began to insist that the student had a gift for alchemy, and if he was guided by an experienced mentor, there was a chance that he would be able to unleash his talent. Besides, this science is a vast sea of knowledge that can help one ascend to the heavens. Under the teacher's endless onslaught, the protagonist sighed and realized that it looked like he was going to have to tell at least some of the truth to get them off his back. Unexpectedly to the girl, he asked if she had been on a flying ship belonging to the sect. Sha Yan replied that she had once managed to be on board. Shu Fan explained that as soon as he saw this great invention, he immediately vowed that one day he would build one for himself. For the protagonist, alchemy was just one step in a bigger plan. That's why he didn't want to become Mr. Sha's apprentice, because then they would both be wasting time. Upon hearing this story, the young teacher's face changed dramatically. She remembered the day that had greatly affected their family. Back then, her older brother had left to learn forging and become the best master in the Heavenly Throne sect. The girl sighed heavily and wished the young apprentice to do his best to become a good blacksmith. She didn't say another word after that. Sha Yan opened the gate and headed back to the school. The protagonist looked sadly after her. He seemed to have succeeded in convincing the girl that freedom was priceless. Besides, Shu Fang needed to find an interesting activity that would bring joy in the next 150 years of the key tempering stage. Suddenly, the guy felt something begin to vibrate in his pocket. It was a magic ball handed to him by Pan Fu. The protagonist took out the communication tool and saw that he had 6 unread news items. He sat down on a stool and began to read the messages. They told of a portal opening for the first time in 50 years, a political visit from the allied sect's mentor, and the fact that the flying ship would return early with rich booty. But what amused Fang the most was the news that the sect's most beautiful female disciple had engaged in pair cultivation with a representative of a rank A martial practitioner. The protagonist thought that it was Wang Yuelong we're talking about. At the same moment, the system alerted to the trespassing of the area. The guy heard a girl's voice wondering if this Su Fan was really that cool. She was led under the arm by Wang Yuelong. He said that without this person, he wouldn't have achieved everything he has now. In addition, the guy asked Qiang Qiang to be more courteous when meeting, because for this person, it is not difficult to solve any problem at the snap of a finger. The girl smiled and said that she understood everything perfectly. There was that Mujun Qiang Qiang, who was the first beauty among all the outer disciples. As he approached the gate, Wang Yuelong called out to his friend and asked if he was home. Seeing his acquaintance, the protagonist immediately appreciated his partner. In his opinion, Sha Yan was more beautiful, as this young female disciple was still immature. Wang Yuelong said hello to his friend and asked how his progress in learning forging was. At the sight of Fanya, Qiang Qiang bowed and said hello. The protagonist asked the girl if she was really engaged in pair cultivation with his buddy. This insight surprised the young student, because not many people actually knew about this news. Wang Yuelong laughed and said that there was nothing to hide from Brother Shu. The protagonist winked at him and said that not everyone would be able to pick up the first beauty of the sect. This kind of news will definitely not go away. He laughed and said that the first thing he did was to bring in his girlfriend to meet Fan. The protagonist invited the guests to come inside. Inside the room, Wang Yuelong demonstrated one of his new abilities for the first time. Using the ring on his finger, he materialized a large amount of food on the table. The astonished Fan recalled that he had previously had to cook a beast carcass brought by a friend in exchange for techniques. He then asked the guys what had happened. Wang Yuelong explained that they had recently met a 9th stage key tempering soul eater. Qiang Qiang had picked up some kind of contagion while fleeing and was now sleeping very badly. In her dream, the evil force told her to go to the soul eater. No sooner had the guy finished talking about the problem than the protagonist immediately summoned some kind of blue orb that headed towards Qian Qian. After realizing the problem, Zhu Fan used an ability called aura cleansing. A few seconds later, there was a small flash above the surprised guests. Immediately afterward, an unknown entity of sinister appearance burst out of the girl's body. With a second shot, the protagonist had no problem dispelling the curse. He also called it a disgrace that Wang Yuelong, who was at the 5th stage of key tempering, had escaped from some soul eater and allowed his girlfriend to be infected. Qian immediately felt an improvement in her health and thanked her savior. The girl was surprised that some strange guy possessed a high-ranked purification technique. The protagonist explained that he started practicing this skill from idleness and eventually smashed it to the perfect stage. The girl admiringly told her boyfriend that this Shufan was indeed incredibly strong. She offered to take him with her to open the portal. Wang Yulong liked the idea because it was unlikely that with his friend's power, they would leave there empty-handed. Before the boy knew it, a bone immediately flew into his head. Zhu Fan was surprised that this oaf was now looking for a bodyguard while including his girlfriend in the persuasion. He explained that it would be dangerous there and advised them all to stay at home to stay alive. Wang Yuelong asked Brother Shu again, did he really not want to go there? According to the talk of many people, the legacy of great masters could be found there. The young fighter added that during the last time the portals had been opened, someone had found the notes of a great master forger that contained descriptions of many lost runes. At this point, the protagonist became incredibly interested. He needed the knowledge of many runes to become an outstanding forging master. Wang Yuelong added that his friend's safety would be guaranteed as there would be beasts at the peak of Qing, tempering at most. These words made Zhu Fan wary. He asked his buddy if he was sure that there would really only be monsters of this rank. Wang Yuelong replied that he had no doubt about it. Sighing, the protagonist asked how to get involved. Yuelong explained that the cost of entry was only 1,000 spirit stones, and the entrance to the portal would open in 10 days at Tianyi Mountain. Realizing that there was still time, Fong decided to delve deeper into the study of forging. Perhaps he could forge something that would increase his chances of survival on the other side of the portal. When the guests left, the protagonist began to continue his introductory course in forging. Unfolding the self-study book, he penetrated the memory of the manual's compiler. A few moments later, Zui Fan found himself in a very strange subspace. Forging was the art of extracting essence from all things and forming new things. Raw materials, runes, and moldings were the basic elements of this craft. At the stage of key hardening, the spiritual fire available is not enough to harden the materials. It required finding a place with abundant spiritual fire and using the benefits of such a place to quench the ore. This was the most basic method of processing raw materials. Even if the materials have undergone initial processing, once received, they need to be hardened again with a hammer. Once this stage is complete, the shaping stage begins. The most important step is to fuse the runes into the item that is not yet cooled. This must be done before the weapon takes its final form. To create the most basic items, you need to use at least 3 runes, of which there are a huge number in the world, so repetition on the same weapon is not allowed. The life of a master forger is a constant search for new runes, because it is their uniqueness and quantity that will determine the final result. In the self-study was presented a list of 1,000 of the most common types of spiritual ore and their features. Finishing the lesson, the protagonist exhaled. Reading this chapter encouraged him once again. Forging was much more interesting than alchemy, after all. But before he could think about it, the orb in his back pocket vibrated again. Taking it out, Zhu Fan saw a message from Pang Fu. In it, the fatty admired the fact that the protagonist was now studying not only alchemy, but also forging. In addition, the informant explained that he had learned something interesting about dual cultivation. His information was related to the joint study of alchemy and forging. Zhu Fan smiled, for such a coincidence was very surprising. A short while later, he headed for the forge halls. Placing some spirit stones in front of the secretary, the guy explained that he wanted to rent a room. A couple minutes later, the protagonist found himself in a room with a natural source of spiritual fire. Now, he was finally ready to try his hand at real forging. To begin with, Zhu Fan decided to put on ice protection so that he wouldn't get burned in case of anything. First, he decided to try something he had only recently studied. To do this, scarlet steel and iron ore concentrate had to be combined. At this moment, he remembered how Pang Fu had arrived at his house to share information about dual cultivation. According to him, when one reached a high level in one of the crafts, a guiding light would descend from the heavens to help one climb to the very top. If one wanted to take the path of dual cultivation, combining forging and alchemy, it would be seen by the heavens as rejecting their help. In such a case, one could only break through with one's own strength. In Xu Fang's understanding, this indicated that even the heavens viewed a person who excelled in two crafts at the same time as a threat. This was even to the protagonist's advantage, as the system itself encourages him to control his breakthroughs on his own. After combining the two materials, the spirit hammers began to process the resulting raw materials. While processing, Xu Fan noticed that this action proved to be very spiritually costly. If he didn't have a huge spiritual resource, even obtaining a sword would prove to be a problem. The guy looked around at the resulting result and realized he was already at the finish line. Now it was up to him to solder the runes into the blade. To do so, he decided to use amplifications on rock hardness, feather lightness, silence, and destruction. But at the same second, there was a massive explosion in the room. When the smoke cleared, Xu Fan saw the billet in front of him shattered into pieces. The guy realized that he had messed up big time, and the raw materials worth 400 spirit stones were irretrievably lost. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Then a man came in, asking what was going on. The old man called himself the manager of the forge halls. He saw the frustrated apprentice in front of him and realized that this was his first time. Realizing that he was facing a professional who understood a lot about this matter, Xu Fan said that he wouldn't let the old man go until he succeeded. After this conversation, the long hours of trying to obtain the first sword dragged on. After a while, Wang Yuelong and his girlfriend were flying in the Tianyi Mountains, heading towards the secret portal. Suddenly, something whizzed past them very quickly. Looking closer, Wang Yuelong saw a very familiar figure flying nearby. It was Xu Fan flying on the sword. The main character didn't understand why these two were torturing the poor crane. Although, on the other hand, it looked a bit romantic. After landing, Wang Yuelong looked at Brother Shui in astonishment. The boy was delighted that his friend had flown here on a sword he had forged himself. He didn't understand how the protagonist had made such progress after only beginning to learn blacksmithing. In addition, Fang flew faster than anyone in the groundwork stage. The protagonist grinned, his friend acting as if he knew him for the first day. The boy said ironically that he could already be called a master forger. A while later, the guardian explained that the portal would be opening soon. He explained that this trial was suitable for disciples at the key tempering stage. After entering the portal, it was forbidden to kill anyone. He also added that the trial is only available to those who have paid the fee. Also, participants will be automatically thrown out after 1 month. Wang Yuelong looked at his friend excitedly and asked if he was coming with them. However, the boy firmly replied that he would act on his own. Instead, he handed the crystal to his buddy. Xu Fan explained that in case of an emergency, spiritual energy should be injected here. This would create high-frequency vibrations that he would sense and come to the rescue. Wang Yuelong didn't have time to thank his friend before he immediately rushed into the portal. After all, Xu Fan had been faster than lightning lately. Meanwhile, the main character appeared on the other side of the portal. This space had a very pure spiritual energy that took one's breath away. In addition, the entrance was surrounded by a forest that had grown in a very fertile environment. Having landed on the ground, the guy realized that the next month would fly by unnoticed. However, he could not do without a stronghold. It wasn't long before Xu Fan built a small hut. This sword was very versatile, which pleased its creator immensely. Commanding his weapon, the protagonist didn't immediately notice a pack of wolves creeping up behind him. Looking back, he glared angrily at the attacking monsters. By the mere sight of the enemy, the wolves realized they had run into the wrong guy. They immediately frantically bowed to Xu Fan. The guy assessed the situation and realized that these were beasts at the 4th stage of key tempering. Deciding that the pack could be useful to him as assistants, the protagonist ordered the wolves to bring everything that could be valuable and useful here. Now that the starting shelter had been built, Xu Fan could go in search of the runes left here by the forging masters. Wandering through the endless forest, he came across a lake. Surely something useful could be found here. Suddenly, there was a huge splash in the water, causing the protagonist to cover himself with his hands. Just like that, a foot stepped on the surface of the lake. A human voice urged the boy not to panic. The unidentified man explained that he had recently subdued a flying sword. Xu Fan remembered that he was not alone here, and someone from the sect had already gotten here earlier. He congratulated the man across from him, however, then took a closer look at him. The sect disciple introduced himself, calling himself Ye Xiao Yao. He had a soft and casual voice and had just subdued one of the artifacts. Zhu Fan couldn't find a place for himself from what he saw. This handsome man looked so attractive that he looked more like the protagonist than the protagonist himself. Nevertheless, the guy held back his emotions and, bowing, introduced himself. After that, he once again took a closer look at the random person he met. Xiao Yao seemed to be favored by the heavens, as the portal had just opened and he had already obtained a large booty. The sword looked very valuable, perhaps even a divine weapon. Xiao Yao said that he was glad to meet him and headed towards Shufeng. The protagonist thought it was a bit strange, but he stayed where he was. Suddenly, Xiao Yao held out a pearl to his interlocutor and said that he wanted to share in honor of the acquaintance. Zhu Fan understood that the meaning of this gift was that he was taking the pearl and pledging to keep his mouth shut, not telling anyone about the rest of the loot. But then the boy had a seemingly crazy thought, and it had to be tested immediately. He started pelting the counterpart with questions related to his dimension. For example, whether Xiao Yao had watched the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, whether he had heard the phrase, "all rivers flow eastward," and whether he had learned some poems from Korean literature. However, the outer student who didn't understand anything asked if his buddy didn't like his gift. Zhu Fan smiled and said that he understood what this was all about. Immediately after that, he deftly snatched the pearl out of his interlocutor's hands as well. Xiao Yao explained that he was very happy that his gift had been accepted. Meanwhile, Shu Fan thought that from now on, he should stay as far away from this character as possible, because protagonists were not always lucky and sometimes got into dangerous situations. Xiao Yao deftly jumped up on his sword and waved his hand, saying that perhaps their paths would cross again. In the next second, he was speeding away at an incredible speed. Zhu Fan exhaled and hoped that this was their last encounter. He also remembered that main characters usually lost a few minor character buddies along the way, and he didn't need that. After that, the guy turned towards the lake and sighed heavily, realizing that he was unlikely to be left with anything there anymore. Night came and Shu Fan returned to his hut. The terrifying eyeless monster opened its mouth and growled menacingly at the guy. Hearing the turtle squeak nastily, Sui Fan tossed it aside, realizing that this Ye Xiao Yao was definitely the protagonist. There was no other way to explain the fact that this type had cleaned the entire bottom of the lake, even poking out the eyes of the poor turtles even though they cost pennies. But even so, the guy liked it here a lot more than he did in the main world. There was a lot more value in this dimension. Suddenly he heard strange rustles and creaks outside the door. As he approached the entrance, the protagonist saw dozens of brightly glowing eyes staring directly at him point blank. He screamed exhaustedly, realizing it was probably a ghost. But at the same moment, dog-like monsters ran into his house, looking at Fang with kind eyes. The pouch that one of the creatures brought contained a small amount of useful resources. The protagonist was surprised that the monsters he had accidentally tamed could work so efficiently. They brought red copper, rootless flowers, unicorn grass, and even spirit stones that were so abundant that there was probably a mine somewhere nearby. However, the dogs gestured that they had collected the loot from the corpses. It was not surprising, for someone must have died after the portal had been opened. This was another reminder not to neglect safety measures. After hiding his house from prying eyes thanks to the spell, Zhu Fan decided to go to bed early so that he could do a better job tomorrow. Getting up early in the morning, the boy prepared a drink and drank it. It was still dark outside, and he thought he shouldn't have woken up before the sun. At this moment, he felt the presence of a foreign aura not far from him. It was a wonder who the Dash had also come here this early. Hearing a distinctive sound from behind, Zhu Fan, that same type, flew here again on his sword. Ye Xiao Yao saw his buddy and said hello to him with a smile. Shu Fan annoyedly thought that this type is definitely the protagonist. Stepping closer, Ye Xiao Yao coughed and looked at the cauldron thoughtfully. There was silence in the air. After a few seconds, Zhu Fan invited the traveler to join him in his meal. After that, the cauldron emptied even more. After tasting the delicious warm soup, Ye Xiao Yao couldn't contain his admiration. The protagonist asked the person he was talking to tell him more about himself. The guy assumed that this type was a rank A fighter. However, Ye Xiao Yao refuted this and said that he was just a candidate to join the swordsmen. However, he had a mentor named Yuan Hui. Shu Fan said that he had heard of this trainer who came from a great swordsman family and was a great master of his craft. At the same time, he thought that the protagonist should naturally have an exceptional mentor. After all, it was a cliché. Fan also noted Ye Xiaoyao's exceptional data, and coupled with the huge production, his growth should be even more rapid. However, the guy thought it was a taunt and said he was used to it by now. He said that he had been an inner disciple at the foundation stage a few months ago, but for some reason, his cultivation had started to degrade. Right now, Xiao Yao was already at the 9th key tempering stage and didn't know when this decline would end. At the moment, he was trying to accumulate as much wealth as possible so that he could live a poverty-free life if he became an ordinary layman. Xu Fang was increasingly repulsed by these words, especially after he looked at his interlocutor's left hand. With a satisfied face, he said that he had no doubt that Xiao Yao would be able to recover his cultivation and return to his rightful place. In turn, the guy appreciated the image of his interlocutor and now had no doubt that this type of person was the protagonist of this story and was worth staying away from. But suddenly, the poor fellow grabbed Xu Fang's hands, causing him to be very puzzled. He was glad that his interlocutor was trying to comfort him. Ye Xiao Yao explained that when others heard about this story, they just laughed, and some even started to look at him with contempt. His eyes shone, and the boy said that he really wanted to be friends with Brother Shui. The protagonist absolutely did not want this, and even such a thought made his body shake. A short while later, the strange interlocutor flew away again. Zhu Fan was sure that if this type of person rolled to the 3rd step, some wise mentor would suddenly appear from the ring. The boy went in search of something interesting, and after an hour he came upon a large tree. He was happy, because it was perfect for building his own ship. Suddenly, a loud cracking sound was heard from behind, followed by the noise of birds flying in different directions. Zhu Fan lazily turned around, realizing that something was about to happen. Soon the ground shook already not far from the protagonist. Then he saw a huge paw come down to the ground right next to him. It was a huge-sized beast that looked like a bear. According to the information, this monster was at the 8th stage of hardening, which allowed the guy to try out the made sword on it. With this thought, Zhu Fan pointed his blade at his opponent. This sword was silent and very fast, and also acted as an excellent means of transportation. The bear didn't even try to fight back, and the blade easily slid into its body. After that, the monster's head began to stonewall. His paw, which was already near the protagonist's head, suddenly began to stop. Suddenly, a stream of blood spurted out of the monster's eyes. After that, the bear cried out loudly, and faintly visible needles flew towards Hui Fan. These small objects, 36 in number, which were elusive to the eye, struck the target with a cold light. The boy grinned and hoped that no one else would distract him from building the ship. Half a day of laborious work passed, and the protagonist finally got his ship. He quoted one of the verses admiringly that if heaven had not given him life, mankind would be living in darkness. Suddenly, the stone that had been lying calmly in his pocket before began to vibrate. This only spoke to the fact that Wang Yuelong was in some kind of trouble. The protagonist confidently jumped aboard his ship and shouted to it to fly forward. The vessel then sped away at high speed. Meanwhile, somewhere in the forest, Wang Yuelong and Mujun Changchang were fleeing. A whole swarm of huge wasps rushed right behind them. At some point, the guy grabbed the girl, who was starting to fall behind. The monsters were getting bigger by the minute, and the pace of their movement didn't slow down. Chiang Chiang asked her boyfriend if he was confident that Xue Fan would be able to save them in time. She explained that in a critical situation, she would be able to use the secret technique of igniting her own spirit and blood, in which case they would be able to break away. Suddenly, the adventurers sensed that the monsters were about to launch some sort of attack. The ground beneath the people's feet began to shake, and then Wang Yuelong decided that it was no longer possible to procrastinate. The very next instant, it rushed forward with renewed speed, and huge stingers began to fall on them from behind. But the guy successfully maneuvered, and they managed to evade the attack. At that time, he also offered to wait a little longer, as his faith in Brother Shu was unshakable. With this thought, Wang Yuelong swallowed another acceleration pill. It was not for nothing that his friend had taught him the technique of fleeing the battlefield. However, this ability consumed a lot of spiritual energy. All of this was being watched closely by the protagonist from above. At that time, Chiang Chiang clarified that acceleration pills were not the answer and asked to be allowed to turn to spirit and blood burning. Looking at these idiots with the eagle eye technique, Zhu Fan thought that these two must have brain thrombosis by now. After all, otherwise, there was no way he could explain why they had gone to the deadly bees, whose habitats even the golden elixir stage wars would have avoided. At that moment, the lovers felt a spiritual energy coming from the sky. When they saw the flash, they realized that Brother Zhu had come to their rescue after all. But at the same second, a wasp sting flew past Wang Yulong. Looking around, the travelers found that they were completely surrounded by a swarm of monsters. At the same time, the monster spotted the flying ship underneath and also headed towards it. Seeing this, Wang Yuelong apologized to Brother Shui for having to involve him in this. Suddenly, a terrifying scream came from the ship. Zhu Fan used an ability called Annihilating Sound Wave to deal massive damage to a huge area. From the power of this skill, the monsters began to be blown away. All the creatures practically died of fright in the first second. The rescued looked up and saw a huge swarm of monsters falling to the ground. A little while passed, and a hook that descended from the ship hooked Wang Yulong by the scruff of the neck. From fright, the guy screamed, and soon he lost consciousness together with his girlfriend. A few seconds later, Shu Fan was already sitting on the lakeside and roasting his prey. He didn't think that using this technique would wear out his body so much. It felt like it would take several days to recover spiritual energy. The protagonist couldn't imagine the losses he would incur because of such nonsense. Zhu Fan came to the conclusion that spells that required spiritual energy would have to be abandoned for the time being. However, skills that utilized mental power were still available. Around this moment, Wang Yuelong gradually began to come to his senses. The boy shouted out in fright that he had really gone to the underworld after all. Shu Fang replied that he had set up his friend because of his stupidity, and he would have to go through all the circles of hell. However, this would not happen today. After waking up, Wang Yuelong tearfully realized that he was still alive and Brother Shu had saved him again. After that, the guy rushed to his lover and started breaking her, trying to bring her to her senses. The protagonist tossed a bottle of mixture to his friend, saying it was something to drink. Fang explained that after the concussion and the sound wave, their brain function was impaired. Although it was actually a first-rate sedative elixir, each vial was worth 600 spirit stones. Wang Yuelong pounced on his friend who had once again saved his life with tears and gratitude. In response, the protagonist shouted angrily that the boy would pay for everything. He added that the life-saving service was worth 20,000 spirit stones, and the vial of elixir was worth 2,000. Wang Yuelong quietly replied that he would have to be a debtor for now, but later, once he got rich, he could give 1,000,000 at once. At that moment, the guy was pinched really hard from behind. He screamed and jumped up in pain. At this moment, Qiang woke up and asked the guy if he felt anything. The lovers immediately rushed to each other and began to cry. This time, the girl turned to their savior and thanked him heartily for what he had done. Taking a bite of the cooked meat, Zhu Fan asked which one of them had the idea to climb into the dwelling of the dangerous bees. Wang Yuelong admitted that the original plan was flawless. But at some point, things went wrong and the monsters discovered them. He then tried to use the battlefield escape technique, but he overestimated his capabilities. Shui Fan irritably asked why they were going there. The guy explained that it was all about the honey from these bees, which had unique healing properties up to and including life extension. Wang Yulong explained that Qiangqiang's mom had once participated in the war, where I acquired a chronic disease. Deliver the honey, he hoped he could help his girlfriend's mom cure the ailment and finally ask for Qiangqiang's hand in marriage. Zhu Fan immediately realized that it was most likely a matter of ransom. He asked his friend if his image from a potential A-rank fighter wasn't enough in his mother-in-law's eyes for a wedding. Wang Yuelong explained that he was already so satisfied that the ransom amount was reduced from 2,000,000 spirit stones to 1,000,000. The protagonist grinned and jokingly called his friend's mother-in-law a saintly woman, since it would only take 10 years to save up for such a thing. Wang Yulong agreed and explained that he wanted to make such a gift so that Mrs. Mumuyun would drop another 500,000. Zhu Fan looked at the enthusiastic guy and remembered how in his past life he had also been extorted a large ransom from him. With this thought, the protagonist threw a piece of meat to his friend. He asked if the boys had managed to get honey. Wang Yulong replied that they had only managed to get half of what they had planned. However, he hoped that even that amount would be enough. The protagonist, meanwhile, stared at the jar of liquid. This honey must be worth a lot of money if it was so hard to get. Besides, forging had nearly bankrupted him lately. He asked his friends how much the substance cost. Qiang replied that in big cities, they give about 2,000 spirit stones per liter for it. Hearing this, Zhu Fan started begging for details from his acquaintances about the place where they had gotten it. The guy decided he wouldn't be stopped by some insects when there was such a great opportunity to make good money. A short while later, Zhu Fan was already riding a deer and galloping through the flower fields towards the bamboo grove of deadly bees. At some point, the animal stopped and the field ended. Ahead began the territory of bees. Putting his fingers on the deer's head, he ordered her to hide somewhere far away. The animal galloped away, and the protagonist rushed into the thicket. 3 days had passed. At the border of a bamboo grove and a flower field, the main character's butt shone in the sun. After finding a large number of opponents, he would diligently bend over in front of them and imitate the flight of a bee by waving his arms. The monsters didn't realize what was going on for a while and stared at the strange movements in bewilderment. However, after hours of convincing them that it was merely their not-yet-faced brother, the bees mistook the strange creature for one of their own. A large number of creatures were flocking to the place where the unknown man had appeared. Everyone wanted to see the protagonist, who was walking confidently into the grove. A while later, he finally found the place he had been looking for so long. In front of the guy were huge mountains of honey that were supposed to enrich him. Zhu Fan calculated that 100 liters would bring him 200,000 spirit stones. In that case, selling even 10,000 liters could bring him eternal financial independence. At the same second, a bee-mate appeared in front of the protagonist, which due to its stable psyche did not succumb to the enchantment technique. Realizing that this monster would not be easy to deal with, he decided to use the skill consciousness paralysis. However, the blue ball he released hit the protective barrier. At the same moment, the system notified the disciple that the bees and their honey were the property of the Heavenly Throne sect. So those who reached here were allowed to take the honey as a reward, but in quantities not exceeding 1,000 liters. Zhu Fan thought frustratedly that all of his plans to instantly enrich himself had been dashed. Meanwhile, in the Cloud Islands of the Heavenly Throne sect, the situation in the portal was being closely monitored. One of the elders who saw this situation was surprised that a disciple at the key tempering stage was able to trick the Death Beast stage and almost paralyze the uterus. Surely this fellow was worth more attention. Zhu Fan was gaining one jar of honey after another, as a voice from above suddenly asked him to stop. He glanced around and looked at the light coming from the sky, thinking that this guy was just a cheapskate. The protagonist loaded large 100-meter cans onto a sword and sent them to the ship. When he returned to his ship after the loot, he estimated that he had only managed to collect 500 liters. But even that would be enough for a new cauldron, better forging tools, and more spellboards. But before he knew it, a familiar bright violet ray swept directly over his head toward the grove. Zhu Fan grinned, realizing that Ye Xiaoyao had already somehow found out about the gold mine and had found a way around the danger. He only wondered how much honey this guy would be allowed to take with him. At the same time in the Heavenly Islands, the elder who was watching the portals was furious. He didn't believe that now every brat at the key tempering stage could reach the honey. Ye Xiaoyao prepared a jug and began to pour honey into it. The guy was pleasantly surprised that even at the key tempering stage, he could move quite a bit faster. After that, Ye Xiaoyao calculated that if he collected 10,000 liters, he could ask his mentor to find a sage at the awakening stage who could determine what was happening to him. Suddenly, a bright light poured down from the sky onto the mountain of honey. When the bright flash passed, the boy found that all the loot was simply gone. He looked around, not realizing what had happened. Ye Xiaoyao then saw a protective dome over the place, on which it was written that the Deadly Bee Bamboo Grove was closed to the public for the next 150 years. The guy annoyed at the sigh and called these elders cheapskates. Suddenly, a threatening voice asked if the brat wanted to conflict with them. Ye Xiaoyao remained silent, and the old man said that if he were him, he would be satisfied with what he had. At the same time, the protagonist arranged a kind of cruise on a flying ship. Almost until the portal closed, he traveled the dimension, finding new mountains, streams, and deserts. On the last day of the journey, the system notified that Zhu Fan had reached the Grand Master's manor. From the name, it was clear that a man who artificially mastered alchemy once lived here. However, the protagonist was still furious as well. This time, he was looking for the Forging Master's manor and came across the exact opposite. Nevertheless, there was only an hour left before the portal was closed. The situation was like the old saying, "I tried to plant flowers, but they didn't bloom." In the meantime, I stuck a willow branch in the ground, and it grew into a shady tree. After failing to stumble upon the legacy of the Forging Masters, Zhu Fan still looked inside the building. Inside was a library with a bunch of valuable spells. Overall, this sortie could be called a success. At least now, he had something to occupy himself during the long evenings. Among the finds was also an all-purpose bag. Now you didn't have to save up to buy a storage ring. The spells Killing Moon and Perfect Intelligence also received special attention. Suddenly, a loud voice spoke out that a month had passed and the portal was closing. Immediately after saying those words, Zuifan found himself high in the air. He looked down and saw directly below him the vast abyss into which he was now about to fall. However, the timely application of body lightning techniques helped to avoid an unfortunate fall. As he was going downstairs, Shufan saw Wang Yuelong and Mujun Qiangqiang flying on a bird. His friend waved at him and said that he could treat him to something at the inn. The boy felt that he owed a debt of gratitude to his savior. Upon hearing this, the protagonist immediately grabbed one of the tablets he had found and silently read it. It was a digestive spell that would speed up the digestion of food, allowing the nutrients and spiritual energy it contained to be better absorbed and strengthen the body and spirit. After that, he turned to his friend and said that in that case, he was ready for something to eat. In reality, Zhu Fang's plan was to eat as much food as possible, which Wang Yuelong had promised to pay for. A few days passed after the portal was closed. By then, the honey of the deadly bees had already been sold at a good price. The medicinal ingredients would be enough to make several cauldrons of first-class pills. After that, the protagonist planned to get some auxiliary raw materials from Pangfu to try forging something serious. Making a paper crane with a list of things he needed, Zhu Fan threw it into the air, and the message flew instead of the Alliance's location. A short while later, Pangfu sent a messenger bird with 10 full bags of ingredients. In response, the protagonist sent a payment of 300,000 spirit stones. Holding the invoice in his hands, he still couldn't believe that he could find such an amount to pay. After that, Xu Fan took a large piece of crushed copper and examined it. It looked like it was a very high-grade ore. Now the guy was ready to go into a long recluse and do forging until he was blue in the face. A full 3 years had passed since that day. Xu Fan once again rented a room in the blacksmithing halls. However, this time he also failed. He had thought that, given his talents, he would be able to forge anything he wanted with his eyes closed in 3 years. But it turned out that forging was a very complicated science. During his experiments, the protagonist came to the conclusion that the runes of energy control and spirit amplification were rejecting each other. However, he could not find the reason for this. After another explosion, Zuifan's head hit the ground, and a brilliant thought came to him. As he jumped to his feet, he thought that perhaps he needed an intermediary rune to succeed. After that, Zhu Fan almost immediately made another attempt. This time there was an explosion again, however, now it looked very different. When the smoke cleared, the protagonist suddenly saw a solid glowing sword. He immediately decided to name the new weapon Thousand Man. Although the guy realized that he had only spent 6 attempts, it was also quite a lot. In these 3 years, he had spent a large amount of spirit stones and materials. After that, Zhu Fan decided to read the latest information from Pangfu. Among the interesting things was that the flying ship had been damaged by the collision with the giant sea beast. The guy hoped that he would be allowed to repair the aircraft. But what drew the main character's attention even more was that Ye Xiaoyao killed the sect traitor at the Golden Erection stage, even though he himself was only at the Foundation stage. Not long ago, this type had degenerated, and now he was killing much stronger people. However, the protagonist was not discouraged this time. He himself had evolved to the 8th stage of ki tempering. Much of this growth was due to the digestive spell. In addition, Xu Weifan had internalized all the ancient recipes from the great alchemist's manor. The protagonist assumed that he himself could destroy the enemy at the Golden Elixir stage when he broke through to the Foundation stage. The Summon Beast spell he found has become one of his favorites. It can summon the spirit of a water dragon, which has combat power at the level of the Foundation stage. In addition, if you find to make a suitable vessel for the spirit of this monster, you can bring its combat power to its peak. In this case, you can fight back enemies a couple of stages higher. With these thoughts, Zui Fan was already at his home. Relaxing, he sat down on the chaise lounge, realizing that he would now be able to rest properly. But before the protagonist could think about it, Wang Yuelong and Mujun Qiangqiang immediately appeared in front of him. Realizing that he couldn't get away from this sweet couple, Zuifan asked why they were so happy. He wondered if Yulong's mother-in-law had finally given in to his pressure. Pressing his lips together, the boy muttered that he did. He then embarrassingly held out the invitation to his friend, shouting that on the 15th of next month, the most momentous event of their lives would take place, and Brother Shu had no right to miss it. After that, Yulong and Qianqiang quickly set the table, arranging many different dishes. They asked if the main character liked the food. Shuifan replied that it was delicious. He looked around at the couple in love and wondered. Even though the two of them looked very cute, the guy didn't feel envious. He was destined to live until he became a great sage. Besides, there was hardly a woman in this world worthy of his attention. After that, the protagonist, having nibbled the last chicken leg, threw the bone on the plate and got up from his seat. He turned around and beckoned the guests to follow him. The boys looked at each other, not understanding what was going on. Walking into the next room, Yulong and Qianqiang were at a loss for words at what they saw. It was a huge annex filled with high-quality weapons. Yulong now understood why Brother Shu hadn't shown them this place before. Qianqiang admiringly called Fong the most talented disciple of the sect. The guy grinned and said he didn't have a wedding gift for the newlyweds, so they could each pick one of any item. Seeing that the lovers had already started to examine the strange items, Su Fan asked them not to touch the warhead and grenade launcher. After all, they weren't working anyway. After a while, two weapons caught Qianqiang's eye. They were swords of insight. The pink blade was responsible for illusions and enchanting the enemy, while the white blade was responsible for speed and armor penetration. In turn, Yulong liked the thousand-man sword. This sword can split into pieces and take arbitrary shapes during battle, which greatly reduces the effectiveness of the opponent's defense. Shu Fan kept his word. So soon the loving couple was contentedly going to their home with their new weapons. Being very sad at heart, the guy waved them off with a smile. He had spent a huge amount of effort and raw materials to craft these blades. However, Zuifan decided that since he had accustomed these people to his tutelage, he would have to bear the burden steadfastly. On the 15th of next month, the wedding was to take place. It was the first time the protagonist had traveled far outside the sect in 3 years, so he had to be prepared. A month later, a group of people saw a strange man near the city gates. Under the weight of the weight being carried, this guy was barely able to stay on his feet. It was Shu Fan, who was carrying a huge bag of belongings. The wedding was to be held in a city called Dayton. It was 6,000 kilometers in a straight line from the capital of their sect. However, this news didn't matter to Shufang because he had his own personal ship. With the vessel directly in front of him, the protagonist felt a painfully familiar aura behind him. Zhu Fan turned around, hoping that he had imagined it. However, his fears were then confirmed. It was indeed Ye Xiao Yao. It was strange that this type of person had so unexpectedly appeared here at this very moment. The guy could only hope that his acquaintance would have a completely different direction of travel. Ye Xiao Yao saw his friend and greeted him with a smile, reminding him that they hadn't seen each other in 3 years. The guy explained that today's meeting once again proved that their destinies were connected. Forcing out a feigned smile, Suifan greeted the acquaintance, saying that he had heard that Ye Xiao Yao was now so a true hero was respected. The interlocutor then asked the protagonist if it was really his ship. Fan explained that it was indeed. Ye Xiao Yao started looking at the deck with interest. He then asked why this aero pressure was made. Fan explained that it made the ship faster. The protagonist asked his acquaintance not to waste his time on him, as they are both busy people. However, Ye Xiao Yao suddenly said that he was going to a friend's wedding. After that, he asked his friend where he was going. Realizing that things were much worse than he thought, Fan asked if this friend's name was Wang Yuelong. Hearing this, Ye Xiao Yao laughed and replied that he was exactly what he meant. The guy was glad that they could have a great conversation all the way to the wedding venue. However, Ye Xiao Yao then suggested to Brother Shu to fly together on his ship because it would be much faster. Fang didn't say anything back because it was humiliating. However, the travelers boarded a faster ship. The speed of the ship almost sent the protagonist overboard. Seeing this, Ye Xiao Yao slowed down the aircraft and apologized to his friend, for he had forgotten that he was only at the key tempering stage. When lunchtime approached, Fang stared in surprise at the table littered with food. The guy asked his interlocutor not to get any more food, but he insisted on eating more. The protagonist thought that this type of demonstrative friendliness was getting out of hand. Suddenly, the travelers sensed something amiss approaching the ship. Ye Xiaoyao immediately snatched one of his blades and rushed towards the bow of the ship, shouting that he would only leave Brother Shu for a few moments as he needed to get rid of a couple of bastards. Immediately afterward, the guy pulled out all his 5 swords and readied them for battle. Looking at the fire burning brightly ahead, he wondered if these idiots had completely lost their fear. The travelers had no sooner flown away from the Heavenly Throne sect than they were already ambushed. The hero was greatly surprised that this guy had 5 swords of different elements. It was already like obsessive-compulsive disorder. Meanwhile, right in front of the ship, there were 5 people sitting on a huge dark cloud. Looking at them, Zuefan thought that he had originally assumed that this would not be an easy walk. Right now, the main character wanted to go back to that day more than anything else, and then he would definitely find a way to scare off that intrusive boy. At this moment, Ye Xiaoyao apologized to his friend for involving him in this. He said that he would distract those scumbags at the Golden Elixir stage to himself, and then send the ship with the protagonist to its destination. The guy assured that these people came after him, so they were unlikely to chase after Suefan. The protagonist immediately thought that if he flew alone, they might catch up and finish him off. At that very second, all 5 bandits pounced on the ship at the same time. Ye Xiaoyao raised his hand and prepared his blades for battle. The guy had already killed one scumbag at the Golden Elixir stage not too long ago, so he was confident that he would succeed now as well. With that thought, he created a huge rune in the sky, which immediately began to emit a bright light. The bandits asked the poor guy if he had decided to scare them with this cheap trick, but in the next second, Ye Xiaoyao faintly waved his hand, and his ship rushed away from this place with tremendous speed. The leader of the raiders ordered a subordinate named Lei Shi to catch up to this puppy at the key tempering stage, finish him off quickly, and return. He tried to stop the fleeing scum by shouting that he couldn't escape a fair fight. But at the same moment, a ringing blow rang out from the blade of one of his swords. The remaining opponents told the brat not to even hope to try to save his buddy in any way. Ye Xiaoyao realized that the situation had now become completely stalemate. However, the guy tried to calm himself down. He had to keep his emotions in check and concentrate on the course of the fight, leaving aside his worries about his friend's fate. That's what his coach had taught him in his time. After that, Ye Xiaoyao gave his opponents a serious look and said that none of them would leave here alive today. Meanwhile, the protagonist, sitting aboard the ship, was contentedly sniffing aroma sticks and praying that the heavens would give him another chance to never leave the sect's territory again. But at this moment, there was a bright red flash from behind, and Shu Fan realized that his prayers would not be answered. Seeing his opponent, Lei Shi grinned and realized that today's walk promised to be easy. The protagonist prepared a summoning spell, realizing that this fight would cost him dearly. The dragon soul suddenly burst out of the ship and caught the attacker off guard. In the next few seconds, the monster took on a physical shell. Lei Shi made no secret of the fact that he didn't expect such a thing from a disciple at the key tempering stage. In response, the protagonist suggested that they should not fight and disperse peacefully. He really didn't want to get into a fight, since the guy had once spent 5,000 spirit stones to extract energy from them. This dragon should have been enough for 15 minutes of fighting. However, Lei Shi confidently shouted out that he would not accept such an offer this time. After that, the worm that was wrapped around his body rushed towards Xuefang. However, the dragon intercepted the monster with its paw and crushed its head. The creature's carcass fell to the side of the ship. In turn, the dragon's spiritual energy level increased dramatically, increasing its rank to the equivalent of the Golden Elixir stage. Looking at the boy's frantic face, the attacker didn't understand how such a weakling managed to pump the summoned creature with so much energy. Meanwhile, the protagonist ordered his minion to kill the man. The dragon pounced on Lei Shi. Meanwhile, Shu Fan rushed away from the place, shouting that he would make 10 more of them when he returned home. Taking advantage of its superior power, the monster effortlessly tore apart the human body. Being practically crushed by the dragon, Lei Shi shouted that these cheap tricks wouldn't help slip out of the hands of the Golden Elixir stage warrior. With those words, he threw the bug towards Shu Fan. Noticing this, the protagonist created several barriers that were meant to merge together and stop the creature. However, the bug was so fast that it effortlessly flew through the defenses and slammed into the guy's head. The system immediately alerted to the onset of the neuroparalytic effect and mental damage. Shu Fan staggered and fell overboard as he approached the edge of the ship. Before he lost consciousness, the guy thought that now he was finished. Some time has passed since the situation occurred. Somewhere in the mountains in one of the old huts, two children were staring in amazement at a stranger. The girl asked her brother if the time would soon come when they could eat meat every day. The boy wiped the head of the lying unconscious protagonist with a napkin and said that it would be right after this immortal celestial woke up. He reminded his sister that Changshan's grandfather had told them to bring out this demigod. In that case, if they didn't become celestials themselves, they would at least live a life of wealth and honor, and rich people eat meat every day. However, the child noted that judging by the man's condition, they were a long way from a sumptuous meal. At this point, Zufan had already scouted the surroundings through his unconscious perception. He was glad that he had been found and rescued, because there was a very good chance that his body could have fallen somewhere in the snowy mountains and frozen to death. All this was also preceded by an incredible battle with a soul-eating worm, which took place half a month in astral space. At first, the monster was winning, taking advantage of the protagonist's weakness and gnawing into his body piece by piece. But it was only recently that Shufang managed to win this long battle and finally came to his senses. The children were about to leave the shack when suddenly an unknown voice called out to them from behind. The main character smiled and said that the guys wouldn't get much of a tip for the massage. At that moment, the little boy remembered his grandfather's instruction that after the man from heaven woke up, they should immediately start beating their foreheads against the ground until that celestial agreed to accept them as his disciples. Only then could their lives be considered settled. The children immediately fell to the ground and asked the unknown man to accept them as his disciples. Shufang was completely surprised, as he had never heard such talk before. The protagonist realized that he would have to create a mysterious atmosphere so that he would definitely be believed. He pulled the children's hands off the ground and asked them to stand up. Zufan then assessed their abilities. The girl had 3 spiritual life roots, while the boy had 4. By the standards of this world, they would be cannon fodder at best. However, these kids are remarkably decent, as nothing was missing from the main character's Omni bag. After that, the guy asked why the kids wanted to become his students. Those simultaneously replied that they wanted to eat meat every day. Such a straightforward answer struck Zufan to the core. It was very cute and further validated the honesty of these kids. Zufan said that he liked this answer, and added that there was something else left to figure out. Guy lifted the children up and used a spell to make them both fall asleep. Then he put the boys to bed. Before the final verdict, he had to check their fates. Only after that could the protagonist decide whether to become a mentor or not. In case their abilities were not enough, the guy was ready to provide these children with a trouble-free life. After that, Zufan sat back down comfortably and examined his hands. It was time to assess his own condition. Although he had finally managed to get rid of the soul-eating worm, but the monster had managed to cause serious damage. Now it would take at least 6 months for the protagonist to recover. Clenching his fist, he decided to make a promise to himself. Putting his foot on his leg, Shufan decided not to leave the sex territory for the next 10 years. But what was more important was to stay as far away from this Ye Xiao Yao as possible from now on. With this thought, Zufan took out a mug and a teapot from the bag. He poured himself some tea and decided that he would need to make more battle dolls when he returned. It was still the most effective way of defense for him. Suddenly, the door to the hut opened, and the same old man named Changshan appeared on the doorstep. His body trembling, he looked at the awakened celestial. Without a moment's thought, the man knelt down and prostrated himself before the demigod. But the protagonist used the same technique to pull the old man's hands off the ground and set the man on his feet. Zufan clarified that there was no need to fall on one's knees in front of him, as it was up to the guy himself to thank his saviors. Then he asked the old man what he wanted most of all. Changshan replied that he had no son or daughter, so he wanted him and his wife to live to a ripe old age without sickness or sorrow. The boy thought it was a very practical but complicated wish. At least part of this request he could fulfill. Shufan held out a vial of liquid to the old man. He explained that there were 10 longevity pills, which should be taken 1 every 2 years. He also promised to take both of his children into the sect and take care of them. Changshan looked at the boy and girl lying on the bed in surprise and asked what had happened to them. The protagonist replied that he had sedated them himself to test the potential for possible acceptance as a disciple of the sect. Realizing that he'd better stay out of the way now, the old man bowed again and left the shack. Shufan thoughtfully looked down and sighed heavily. Sometime later, he decided to finally find out the results of the test. Two balloons with information about the children appeared in his hands. The boy will live a long life and die at a very old age in the circle of his loved ones. He will live through a lot of things, but not his soul will remain unchanged. The girl, on the other hand, was much more interesting. She could reach serious heights in cultivation because she had good data for it. Afterward, the main character petted the children, saying that once they woke up, their lives would no longer be the same. Meanwhile, Wang Yulong was sitting in the Heavenly Throne Sect's territory near the gate leading to his friend's courtyard. The boy with shaky hands thought about his missing brother Shu. He was annoyed that something had happened to his friend the one time he had left the sect's territory to attend their wedding. Qiang Qiang served a plate of food to her newly married husband and asked him not to worry so much, for they both knew that Shu Fan was so strong that he could move mountains. The girl assumed that the protagonist was now somewhere healing his wounds and would be back here soon. Wang Yulong asked not to be consoled, for he was entirely to blame for his friend putting himself in such danger. The guy told his wife that he would wait for Shu Fang until he returned. Wang Yulong explained that he had prepared a special envelope for his friend to hand to him personally. The girl glanced understandingly at her inconsolable husband, but there was nothing she could do about it. She made herself comfortable next to him and said she would wait with him in that case. Meanwhile, the protagonist went to see the representative of the Heavenly Throne Sect. He said that these children met the standards of their organization and gave them a special identity card, recognizing them as Shu Fang's disciples. After that, the travelers boarded a ship and traveled to the sect's territory. The boy excitedly asked his mentor if it was really very difficult to become like him. The protagonist smiled and explained that if the disciples listened to him carefully, their path to cultivation would be much easier than his. At the same time, he really liked this boy, as his naive questions coupled with his caring and responsible nature only added to his cuteness. Meanwhile, the girl was restlessly running around the side of the ship looking for food. The boy asked excitedly if this meant that he and his sister would be able to eat meat every day. Shu Fanya laughed very loudly and said that in their sect, one could eat meat at least 3 times a day. Suddenly, Wang Yuelong, who was sitting on the ground, saw a flash in the sky, characteristic of his friend's ship. He excitedly jumped to his feet and saw brother Shu, who after many days had finally returned. Wang Yuelong immediately ran up to his landed buddy and started saying that he had already thought of the worst outcome. Shu Fan said that he was fine and added that the worst thing that happened to him was missing his friend's wedding. The boy said that it was nothing because the most important thing was that the main character was alive. At the same time, his attention was drawn to the children standing nearby. Wang Yuelong then pointed his finger at the frightened guys and asked who they were. Hearing no answer, he was startled that a friend had managed to give birth to 2 children at once in 2 weeks, which had already grown so much. Qiang Qiang looked at her husband like an idiot and said that it definitely couldn't be. Zhu Fan scratched the back of his head and said that these were his disciples. Then he wanted to introduce the children to his friend, but only now he realized that he didn't even know their names. Turning around, the guy awkwardly asked his charges for their names, but the boy suddenly said they had no name yet. That's because, according to the ancient tradition of their village, a name is only given when a child finds a spirit plant. The protagonist wondered about this oddity. However, he quickly found a solution. The guy explained that from now on, the children would carry his surname. Pointing his finger at the boy, he said that he would be called Shu Gang. In turn, the girl the protagonist decided to name Shu Yuexian. Both children fell to the ground and thanked their mentor for giving them their names. After that, Zhu Fan decided that the disciples needed to change their clothes, as it was better for them to not walk around in wrappings here. The main character formed 2 small pink spheres in the air. These objects suddenly rushed towards the surprised students. Immediately, energy began to pour out of each ball. Not a second later, both students immediately changed into their new uniforms. Mujun Qiang looked at the previously unseen magic in surprise and asked what kind of spell it was. Shu Fan explained that he created this skill when he was bored and called it a closet ball. Inside, fabrics are stored, allowing you to change your outfit in an instant. Qiang Qiang was very interested in this invention and asked Brother Shu to sell her one for spirit stones. However, the protagonist said that he could give the orb to his friend's wife for nothing. Having obtained an interesting object at her disposal, the girl immediately experimented, creating a new, beautiful dress. Zhu Fan immediately cried out in panic and asked her to create something else. Seconds later, Qian Qian was wearing another dress. However, it too turned out to be not very decent. The next few attempts looked a little more decent, But Zhu Fan still couldn't separate himself from the intrusive thoughts. At one point, he clutched his eyes hard and shouted that he couldn't look at it anymore. The girl asked why they didn't like the options presented. Zhu Fan explained that he didn't understand anything about women's fashion, so she'd better experiment with the balloon at home. In an attempt to create a better atmosphere, Wang Yuelong said that they should celebrate the return of the main character and his acceptance of the first disciples. Xu Fan leaned over to the children and said that they would now go eat something meaty. The satisfied disciples headed inside the courtyard. At the same time, Wang Yuelong reached into his pocket. He took out a red envelope and held it out to his friend. Zhu Fan asked in bewilderment what it was. However, Yulong only replied cryptically that the guy knew what it was for. Not knowing what to expect, the protagonist nodded in response and took the mysterious gift.
Pet the cat.